He was the kindest judge in America, known for dismissing tickets with a smile. But on one extraordinary day, the city's most powerful woman tried to threaten his court, and the entire city held its breath to see if justice would truly be blind. The air in that courtroom was always thick with something you couldn't quite name. It wasn't just fear, though there was plenty of that. It was a strange cocktail of desperation, hope, and the stale smell of old paper and cheap disinfectant. I was there for a parking ticket, a ridiculous $25 fine for being 6 inches over a freshly painted line that wasn't there the day before. In the grand scheme of things, it was nothing. But to me, a freelance graphic designer trying to make rent, $25 was a decent lunch for 3 days. So I sat on the hard wooden bench, rehearsing my little speech, waiting for my name to be called. And then there was Judge Caprio. Everyone in Providence knew him. You didn't even have to have been in trouble with the law. His show was a local legend, a little pocket of televised compassion in a world that felt increasingly harsh. He was older, with a kind, crinkled face, and a way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. He'd just finished with a young woman who'd run a stop sign. She was a single mom, working 2 jobs, and was late dropping her kid at daycare. He listened, nodded, and ultimately dismissed the ticket, telling her to drive safe and give her child a hug from him. That was the Judge Caprio everyone knew and loved. The whole room seemed to breathe a little easier. My own parking ticket suddenly felt ridiculously small, almost embarrassing. The clerk called the next name, and the atmosphere in the room changed so fast it was like a window had been slammed shut. "Eleanor Vance!" A collective, barely audible gasp rippled through the benches. Heads turned. I turned too. From the back of the courtroom, a woman stood up. She wasn't just well-dressed. She looked like she'd been sculpted from money. Her cream-colored suit was impeccably tailored. Her blonde hair was swept into a flawless chignon, and the click-clack of her designer heels on the linoleum floor echoed like gunshots in the quiet room. She didn't walk to the podium. She strode, a look of bored annoyance etched onto her face. This wasn't just any citizen. This was Eleanor Vance, the mayor's wife, our city's unofficial queen. Judge Caprio looked at her over his glasses, his expression unchanging. "Mrs. Vance, good morning." "Judge," she said, her voice smooth but cold. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement, like a monarch nodding to a courtier. "I have a few citations here," he said, shuffling the papers. "One for traveling 45 miles per hour in a 20-mile-per-hour school zone on March 14th. Another for parking in a designated handicapped space without a permit on March 17th. And a third for an illegal U-turn on a main thoroughfare during rush hour on March 20th. Total fines amount to $750. How do you plead?" A murmur went through the crowd. This wasn't a simple parking ticket. This was a pattern of blatant disregard for the rules everyone else had to live by. Eleanor Vance let out a small, condescending laugh. It was a terrible sound. "Plead? Judge, surely this is just a misunderstanding, a clerical error." "I assure you, Mrs. Vance, the ticketing officer's reports are quite detailed," Judge Caprio said calmly. "Would you like to hear his statement regarding the school zone violation?" "That won't be necessary," she snapped, her politeness cracking. "I am a very busy woman. My husband, Mayor Vance, runs this entire city. Sometimes, in the course of our duties to the public, minor infractions are unavoidable." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "We are important. The rules are for the little people." Judge Caprio's kindly face didn't move a muscle, but his eyes hardened just a fraction. "The law, Mrs. Vance, is unavoidable for everyone. The sign says 20 miles per hour for a reason, to protect children. Were you in a hurry that morning?" "I had a fundraising gala to organize for the Children's Hospital," she said, her voice dripping with self-importance. "So you see, in a way, I was helping children, far more than crawling along at a snail's pace would have." I saw the bailiff shift his weight. Even he looked uncomfortable. This was a side of Providence we didn't usually see out in the open. "And the handicapped spot?" the judge pressed, his voice still even. "It was raining, and it was the closest spot to the entrance of a boutique. I was only going to be a moment." She said it as if it were the most reasonable explanation in the world. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his hands clasped on his desk. "Mrs. Vance, I have had people in this courtroom, people in wheelchairs, who have had to park 3 blocks away and navigate treacherous sidewalks because the spot the city designated for them was occupied by someone who was just going to be a moment. Your moment of convenience is their significant hardship." The color rose in Eleanor Vance's cheeks. Her mask of cool superiority was crumbling, replaced by a raw, ugly fury. She leaned into the microphone. "Judge," she began, her voice low and menacing, "I think you are failing to appreciate the situation here. My husband has a great deal of respect for the city's institutions, and for the people who run them. He allocates their budgets. He signs off on their appointments. He would hate to see that respect diminished, because one judge can't see the bigger picture." The room went dead silent. It wasn't just a defense anymore. It was a threat. A direct, undisguised threat to the man sitting on the bench, delivered in the king's English in a room full of people who paid his salary. She was threatening Judge Caprio's court, his career, his legacy, all over a few traffic tickets. Judge Caprio didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stared at her. He took off his glasses, slowly, and polished them with a small cloth from his pocket. He put them back on, his gaze never leaving her face. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. You could feel the weight of the city, of justice itself, resting on his next words. He was a man known for his compassion, for finding the human story behind the violation. But there was no story here, only pure, unadulterated arrogance. And in that crushing silence, every single one of us held our breath, waiting to see if the kindest judge in America was about to be broken. Judge Caprio placed his polished glasses back on his nose, the movement slow and deliberate. He looked at Eleanor Vance, and for the first time there was no trace of the grandfatherly compassion he was so famous for. His gaze was as clear and hard as crystal. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. "In this courtroom there are no mayors, and there are no mayors' wives. There are only citizens, and the law. The seal of the state of Rhode Island is behind me for a reason. It signifies that the justice administered here is on behalf of the people, all of the people, not just the ones with influential husbands." Eleanor's lips curled into a sneer. "That's a very pretty speech, Judge. I'm sure it plays well on television. But principals don't pave roads, and they certainly don't fund courthouse renovations. My husband does." The second threat was even more brazen than the first. The air crackled with it. I saw a man in the front row actually shake his head in disbelief. This woman was trying to leverage her husband's political power, in public, to get out of a speeding ticket. Judge Caprio simply nodded, as if she'd just commented on the weather. "Thank you for your perspective on civic financing, Mrs. Vance. Now let's get back to the matter at hand. I believe we have the ticketing officer present. Officer Miller, would you please approach?" From the side of the courtroom, a young police officer stood up. He looked like he was barely out of his 20s, with a crisp uniform and a nervous energy about him. As he walked past Eleanor Vance, she gave him a look of such utter contempt it could have curdled milk. He stood before the judge, swallowed hard, and stated his name and badge number. "Officer Miller," Judge Caprio began, his tone now gentle, reassuring. "Could you please recount the events of the afternoon of March 14th regarding the citation you issued to Mrs. Vance?" "Yes, Your Honor," the officer began, his voice a little shaky. "I was positioned on Blackstone Boulevard near the Lincoln School for dismissal-time traffic enforcement. It's a clearly marked 20-mile-per-hour school zone. At approximately 3:15 p.m., I clocked a black luxury SUV traveling at 45 miles per hour. I initiated a traffic stop. The driver was Mrs. Vance." "And what happened during this stop?" the judge asked. "Well, sir, when I informed her of the reason for the stop, she handed me a business card for the mayor's office and told me to take it up with him. She said she was on important city business and that I was detaining her unlawfully." Eleanor Vance scoffed loudly. "He's exaggerating. I was perfectly polite." "Did she mention a gala for the children's hospital, officer?" Judge Caprio asked, ignoring her outburst. The young officer looked confused. "A gala? No, Your Honor. She said she was late for a hair appointment." A wave of snickers rippled through the courtroom, quickly suppressed. Eleanor's face went from pale to a deep, blotchy red. She glared at the officer, her eyes filled with venom. "That's a lie. He's a liar. He's just some rookie trying to make a name for himself by harassing the mayor's wife. Mrs. Vance, you will allow the officer to speak without interruption, or I will have you removed," Judge Caprio said, his voice flat and cold as a stone. She snapped her mouth shut, but her fury was a palpable force in the room. The judge turned back to Officer Miller. "Thank you, officer. That will be all for now." As the young man retreated to his seat, visibly relieved, Judge Caprio picked up a piece of paper from his desk. He stared at it for a moment before looking back at the mayor's wife. "Mrs. Vance," he said, holding up the paper, "you told this court just a few minutes ago that your haste was in service of a noble cause, a fundraising gala for the Children's Hospital. You said you were helping children." "I was," she insisted, lifting her chin defiantly. "My schedule is very complex. It's a whirlwind of charity events and civic duties." "I'm sure it is," the judge said softly, "which is why I find this so puzzling." He adjusted his glasses. "This is a printout of the online social calendar from the Providence Chronicle, a publication that covers the city's high society events in meticulous detail. It lists all the major charity functions weeks in advance." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. According to the Chronicle, the Children's Hospital fundraising gala was held on the evening of March 12th. The words dropped into the quiet room like stones into a still pond. March 12th, 2 full days before she was caught racing through a school zone. The lie was laid bare, stripped of all its self-important justifications. It wasn't just a lie to get out of a ticket. It was a lie she told in a court of law, to a judge. Her story about helping children was a complete fabrication, used to cover up a simple, selfish act. The blood drained from Eleanor Vance's face. For the first time since she entered the room, her look of arrogant entitlement was gone, replaced by a flash of genuine panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his kind eyes now sharp and penetrating, pinning her in place. His voice was low, but every single person in that room heard it clearly. "So, Mrs. Vance, since we now know you weren't rushing to organize a children's charity event, and Officer Miller testifies you were rushing to a hair appointment, perhaps you would like to clarify for the court. Which lie would you like me to enter into the official record?" The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, the frantic beat of your own heart. Eleanor Vance stood frozen at the podium, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her in real time. The question Judge Caprio had asked wasn't just about traffic tickets anymore. It was about character, about truth. And it had been laid out for everyone in this room, from the bailiffs to the petty offenders like me, to see. Her lie, so casually deployed, had been expertly dismantled, leaving her completely exposed. Her face, a moment ago pale with shock, now contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The last vestiges of her regal composure vanished, burned away by the humiliation. Her voice, when it finally came, was no longer smooth and controlled. It was a low, guttural snarl. "How dare you?" she hissed, gripping the sides of the podium so hard her knuckles turned white. "How dare you speak to me like that? Do you have any idea who I am?" "I believe we have established that," Judge Caprio replied, his voice still infuriatingly calm. "You are Eleanor Vance, a citizen of Providence, who has been ticketed for 3 separate traffic violations, and has now, it appears, attempted to mislead this court." "This is a joke, a kangaroo court," she spat, her voice rising in pitch and volume. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Some little man in a robe getting to feel powerful by embarrassing me. When my husband hears about this, when he hears how you've treated his wife, this whole pathetic little TV show of yours will be a memory. This courthouse will be a parking lot. You'll be lucky to get a job as a crossing guard." The threats were escalating, becoming wilder, more desperate. It was like watching a cornered animal lash out. The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were sitting in stunned, wide-eyed silence. We weren't just watching a court case. We were watching the public meltdown of the most powerful woman in the city. Judge Caprio didn't react to her outburst. He didn't gavel her into silence. He simply let her words hang in the air, a testament to her own character. He waited until she had run out of breath, her chest heaving, before he spoke again. "Are you finished, Mrs. Vance?" She just glared at him, breathing heavily. "Good," he said, his tone shifting. It was no longer the voice of a patient adjudicator. It was the voice of a man who had reached his limit. "Because now I will speak. For 20 years I have sat on this bench. I have seen people at their best and at their worst. I have seen poverty, sickness, desperation. I have seen people who have made terrible mistakes, who are drowning in debt, who are fighting just to survive. And many of them, Mrs. Vance, many of them show more grace, more humility, and more respect for the law than you have shown here today." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You speak of power. You wield your husband's name like a weapon. But the power in this room does not belong to you or your husband. It belongs to the people of this city. It is their laws you broke. It is their children you endangered. It is their designated parking spaces you stole out of pure convenience. And it is their court you have held in contempt with your arrogance and your lies." He picked up his gavel. The sound it made when it struck the block was like a crack of thunder, making everyone, including me, jump. "I find you guilty on all 3 counts," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. "For speeding in a school zone, the fine is $500. For the illegal U-turn, $100. For parking in a handicapped space, the maximum fine of $250. Total fines, $850. Eleanor Vance looked like she was about to explode. "This is an outrage. I will not pay it. I will appeal this to a real court." "You are welcome to do so," Judge Caprio said smoothly. "But that is not all." He paused, and a strange, unreadable expression crossed his face. It wasn't anger. It was something else, something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Your behavior today, your blatant disregard for the safety of others, your contempt for the legal process, and your attempts to intimidate this court demand more than a simple fine." He looked past her, scanning the faces in the gallery. He seemed to look at the young mother from earlier, the man in the worn-out work boots, even me, with my stupid little parking ticket. It felt like he was speaking to all of us. "The law must be a shield for the weak, not a sword for the powerful," he said, almost to himself. Then he focused back on Eleanor Vance, his final decision hanging in the balance. "Therefore, Mrs. Vance, in addition to the fines, I am sentencing you to a penalty that I hope will afford you a new perspective. A penalty that will allow you to understand the real-world consequences of your actions." The whole city was about to hear this. The cameras were rolling. The reporters in the back were scribbling furiously. What could it be? Community service? A driving class? Judge Caprio looked Eleanor Vance dead in the eye, his face as serious as I had ever seen it. "I am ordering the immediate and permanent revocation of your driver's license." Ati. A collective, unified gasp sucked the air out of the room. It was louder and more shocked than anything that had come before. Permanent revocation, not a suspension, not a probationary period, forever. In a city built for cars, it was a social and logistical death sentence. For a woman like Eleanor Vance, whose entire life revolved around being seen at the right places at the right times, it was unthinkable. Eleanor herself seemed to short-circuit. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound emerged. The rage drained away, replaced by a slack-jawed, hollow-eyed disbelief. The color was gone from her face, leaving a pasty, grayish pallor. You can't do that," she finally stammered, the words barely a whisper. "I assure you, Mrs. Vance, under Providence Municipal Code, Chapter 14, Section 32, regarding egregious and repeated moving violations coupled with demonstrable contempt of court, I most certainly can," Judge Caprio stated, his voice ringing with the finality of a closing iron door. "The city of Providence will be safer without you, behind the wheel of a 2-ton vehicle you seem to regard as a personal battering ram." He turned to the bailiff. "Bailiff, please escort Mrs. Vance to the clerk's office to surrender her license and make arrangements for payment of the fines." The bailiff, a large man who had remained impassive through the entire ordeal, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle but firm. That single word seemed to break the spell. Eleanor's eyes snapped back into focus, filled with a wild, desperate panic. "No! Get your hands off me! I'm calling my husband! I'm calling the press! This isn't over!" She fumbled in her designer handbag for her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip it. But it was over. The bailiff calmly took her by the elbow, and for all her blustering, she was powerless. All the influence, all the money, all the power vested in her husband's name meant nothing in this moment. She was just another citizen being led away, her threats turning into pathetic, sobbing pleas, as she was guided out of the courtroom. The click-clack of her heels was gone, replaced by the sound of a defeated shuffle. The moment the doors swung shut behind her, the courtroom erupted. Not into applause, but into a low, buzzing murmur of sheer astonishment. People were turning to each other, eyes wide, whispering in disbelief. They had just witnessed a public takedown of the city's most untouchable figure. They had seen a man of principle stand up to a bully and win, not with anger, but with the simple, unyielding weight of the law. Judge Caprio sat on the bench, looking out at the room. He looked tired, older than he had an hour ago. He picked up the next file from his stack. It was my ridiculous parking ticket. "Michael Bell," the clerk called out, his voice sounding a little shaky itself. I walked to the podium on legs that felt like jelly. My meticulously rehearsed speech about the poorly painted line felt absurd now. I stood before him, and he looked down at my file, then up at me. His kind eyes had returned. "Mr. Bell," he said softly. "Parking ticket. You were over the line." "Yes, Your Honor," I managed to say. "The line was new. I didn't see it." He nodded slowly, studying my face. "It's been a long morning," he said, more to himself than to me. "Sometimes, Mr. Bell, the lines aren't as clear as they should be, and sometimes, even when they are perfectly clear, people choose to drive right over them as if they don't exist at all." He looked me in the eye. "You know, the world is full of rules, some big, some small. Most of them are there for a reason, to keep us from crashing into each other, to keep our children safe, to make sure there's a space for those who need it most. It's important to respect the lines, Mr. Bell. All of them." "I understand, Your Honor," I said, my voice filled with a sincerity that surprised me. He gave me a small, weary smile. "I believe you do." He picked up his stamp and brought it down on my file with a soft thud. "Case dismissed. Drive safely. And watch out for the fresh paint." I walked out of that courthouse into the bright Providence sunlight feeling different. My $25 problem had vanished, but that wasn't it. I had witnessed something profound, an act of quiet courage that reaffirmed your faith in the whole system. The story, of course, was all over the news by evening. Mayor's wife license revoked permanently. The city was stunned. The mayor's office issued a terse, "No comment." Eleanor Vance, stripped of her car and her aura of invincibility, vanished from the high society pages. The fallout was immense. Mayor Vance's approval ratings plummeted. He lost his next election in a landslide. The story of what happened in that courtroom became a local legend, a cautionary tale about arrogance and a tribute to the quiet old judge who believed that justice, true justice, has to be blind. For everyone, no exceptions. Judge Caprio became more than a local celebrity. He became a symbol of integrity. And every now and then, when I'm driving through the city and I see a school zone or a handicapped spot, I think of that day. I think of the lines, both the ones painted on the pavement and the invisible ones that define a decent society. And I slow down, check my position, and make sure I'm doing my small part to stay well within them.